Recently, it seems like we are constantly globetrotting around the world, tracking the disaster of the day, though today's conflagration is less about immediate ignition and more about long-term intrigue. The subject? China, and a growing corruption scandal that threatens the stability of the People's Liberation Army. The spark of the most recent fireside chat on corruption is this Bloomberg article, which includes some interesting nuggets about just how bad things have allegedly gotten. But today's video is really about interrogating the accuracy of a single claim from it, that Xi is less likely to contemplate major military action than would have otherwise been the case. The reason that I want to single out that question is because explosive revelations like this are frequent, whether due to corruption or otherwise, and claims like the above almost always follow from them. Thus, even if you do not care at all about China, stay with me, because this will matter for wherever you do care about. In truth, there is a major problem. Once you sit down and spend a moment working through the logic, it all falls apart. Well, sort of. You see, you could interpret this claim as China is less likely to want to engage in military action. But another interpretation of it is China is less likely to engage in military action. They seem so similar, but option 1 and option 2 are not the same. One of them reasonably follows from the premises. The other does not. To understand why, today's journey will have 6 steps. First, we will briefly review the allegations of major corruption in China. Then we will talk about how it does indeed make China less inclined, emphasis on inclined, to initiate a crisis with Taiwan or anyone else. And yes, this part will feature a tasteful dose of lines on maps. But the problem here is that this logic suffers from something known as the Robinson-Crusoe Fallacy. And watch out, because I will then lay it on thick to explain why it does not obviously change the likelihood of a conflict. We will conclude with some fun speculation on how things like this can alter the probability of war, though. But we begin with a brief overview of what has happened. And I am going to emphasize brief, because the point of this video is not to explore the scandal itself, but rather analyze what these things do to the probability of conflict. The main issue surrounds the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or PLARF, or PLARF? Acronyms aside, the entity is a ballistic missile bonanza, as China has the largest land-based collection in the world. Indeed, the PLARF would play a major role in any invasion of Taiwan. At the risk of stating the obvious, Taiwan is an island, and thus any invasion of it will come from the Taiwan Strait. This will give the island plenty of time to bombard any attacking ship with its own collection of land-based missiles, and stop an amphibious landing. Thus, the PLARF's vital role here would be to preemptively strike Taiwan's missiles, thereby setting up a mere naval battle between the two parties. Side note, while everyone else has been focused on Russia and Ukraine for the last couple of years, the US Navy has collectively shrugged for the most part, as the only water-based ingress there is via the Black Sea, which requires entry through the Bosporus Strait after transiting the Mediterranean, which Turkey would prefer not to happen. That is a long way of saying that the US Navy's mental energy has been squarely focused on the Pacific, and that the Navy would have something to say about an invasion. Anyway, all of this presupposes that the PLARF can succeed in its preemptive role, but the report pressed X to doubt that, citing the force's inability to get its rocket lids to come off. Meanwhile, there are plenty of other meaty allegations tangential to the main report, including the theft of rocket fuel to heat hotpot, yum, water filled into fuel tanks to hide that deed, and nuclear silos also malfunctioning. At least a dozen officials have been dismissed as a consequence of all this, including the top 2 commanders of the PLARF. And if that were not enough, on top of that, China's defense minister got sacked in October 2023 after only 7 months on the job. The reason why is shrouded in mystery, but there is plenty of speculation that it is connected to corruption. And to top it off even further, China's foreign minister lost his job 3 months earlier, with whispers of a scandalous extramarital affair or involvement in some activity that compromised national security. Even if that is unconnected to the more recent revelation, it is hard to imagine what the media landscape would be like in the United States if the equivalent happened in Washington. Imagine that Antony Blinken and Lloyd Austin suddenly stopped working. Moreover, the hypothetical reason was not just because Blinken was grafting unassigned State Department money to fund A. Blinken's next world tour, or because Austin was using Department of Defense money to fund, undeclared operations. No, it would be like if they took money, and in doing so, deliberately crippled the US armed forces. Again, my goal here is not to analyze the veracity of any of these claims. If you want to learn more about that, and also enjoy PowerPoints narrated with an Australian accent, then you probably already know to hop on over to Emotopia. It's okay, I'll still be here in an hour. And as a political scientist, I feel obligated to note that corruption is a good justification to conduct a purge. And further, it is helpful to have all significant lieutenants attached to you be guilty of corruption so that you can hold it over them to enforce loyalty. But once more, that is not our purpose for today. Instead, our task is to interrogate the veracity of the claim that any of this would make Xi less inclined to start a war. You will remember that I said earlier that there were 2 ways to interpret this claim. For now, let's focus on the want to one. Get excited, because it's time for some lines on maps. To help us along today, we will use Taiwan and an index of mainland control, which ranges from a fully independent country to a PRC province. In the event of a war with the PRC, imagine that the expected level of Taiwanese autonomy is where that white line be. This is much easier to think about in the context of a land war in Europe, where the white line would represent the expected territorial division. But we are high-functioning adults here, so we can handle a little bit of abstraction. Back to Taiwan. If there were a 50% chance of PRC victory, and a 50% chance of Taiwanese victory, then that averages out to about here. In fact, you can mentally draw that line wherever you want to, because the exact location is irrelevant for the rest of this conversation. Anyway, remember that war is costly, and so this space between the white and red lines represents how the PRC internalizes human sacrifice vis-a-vis Taiwanese autonomy. Thus, you get a literal red line that represents the PRC's metaphorical red line. If Taiwan declares a policy that goes past it, then Beijing would rather fight a war than allow it to continue. Okay, maybe not nukes, but you get the idea. We could repeat the same exercise over the myriad of other maritime and territorial disputes that the PRC is facing, but we will mostly stick with Taiwan for the sake of tractability today. The upshot here is that we now have a visual way to represent how much Xi wants to invade Taiwan. The higher it goes, the more he is interested. Rewinding a moment, remember that we draw the red line as a set distance from the white line. So wherever the white line goes, the red line has to track with it. But remember that the white line is the expected outcome of the war. The inability to open missile doors would seem to inhibit your ability to win. Thus, when the expected outcome goes down, hey, look at that, so too does Xi's willingness to fight. So far, so good for the implication. The problem here is that the deeper discussion suffers from something known as the Robinson-Crusoe Fallacy. The red line moves, yes, but the policy to which Xi compares the red line to is not randomly chosen by monkeys throwing darts at a map, though that would be adorable. Fortunately for both animal rights advocates and Taiwan, other actors have agency here, and it is the collection of those various actors that determine peace versus war. Let me draw you an analogy. Imagine that you have the most dominant basketball player in the league. Unfortunately, as great as he is, the man has one kryptonite: free throws. He averages 20 attempts at the charity stripe per game, but only sinks 10 of them. As a result, opponents will intentionally foul him just for the purposes of sticking him on the line. Recognizing the flaw in his game, he puts in extra time at the gym during the off-season. All parts of his game remain just as perfect as before, but now he can hit free throws at a 75% clip. He goes into the next season expecting his points per game to increase by 5, but then is shocked to learn by the end of the year that he only went up by 2. Our protagonist is guilty of committing the Robinson Crusoe Fallacy. Yep, that is the actual name of it. Now, at the risk of inceptioning our analogies, Robinson Crusoe begins the book thinking that he is stranded alone on a desert island. He therefore spends his time optimizing his life with only his concerns in mind. Then he discovers that he is not alone, and consequently begins changing his behavior. Probably should stick to the hotpot, and to clarify, not human pot. Here, our basketball player treated his free throw opportunities as though he were playing the game alone, and wrongly assumed that he would continue getting 20 free throw opportunities per game. In reality, opponents recognized his improvement and simply became more reluctant to foul him. Why did his scoring only marginally improve? Part of the improvement came from his higher free throw percentage, and part of it was because he scored more field goals because the defenders were more reluctant to foul him. However, much of the benefit actually got diffused to his teammates, who were scoring more now that possessions no longer ended with an immediate intentional foul to our story's protagonist. War is not like running, or swimming, where what you do has almost no impact on others. Those are basically solitaire. That is part of why people only watch those sports every 4 years. Rather, war is like basketball, or baseball, or cricket, or football with freedom, or football but upside down. To paraphrase everyone's favorite early 19th century German military planner Karl von Clausewitz, war is not fought against inanimate matter. It is directed at an animate object that reacts. And so too is the geopolitics that determines war versus peace. This is, by the way, why we spend so much time doing math. When we work on models of war, we do not solve for just a single player's strategy. Rather, we solve for an equilibrium, where everyone is balancing their own interests the best that they can against everyone else's interests. That way, when something in the world changes, say China's military declines, there is no need to mess around with the numbers to resolve the case. Everything is already solved for in terms of everything else, so we can tell you how the initial change changes the PRC's behavior, how that reaction changes Taiwan's behavior, how the reaction to the reaction changes the PRC's behavior, how the reaction to the reaction to the reaction changes Taiwan's behavior, how the reaction to the reaction to the reaction to the reaction changes the PRC's behavior, and all the way to infinite regress. And that takes us to the answer to the second interpretation of the original claim. Does this change the probability that the PRC will start a conflict? And the answer to that question is nebulous. Think about the situation from Taiwan's perspective. The game being played there is to figure out just how much autonomy the island can push for, without inducing the PRC to start a war. In other words, it is a fun game of guess where the red line is. If it is here, then Taiwan wants to push autonomy to here. But if it is here, then Taiwan wants to push further to here. Note that the change in the hypothetical war outcome changes the outcome obtained in peace, making Taiwan happier and the PRC sadder. but it does not actually change whether a war is occurring. This is a well-known relationship in the crisis bargaining literature. If you open up the graduate-level textbook on the subject, then see, it has its very own section. The idea is called neutrality, which is confusing because it evokes mental images of Switzerland, but it actually refers to how the probability of war tends to be neutral in the distribution of power. Everything just gets converted into greater policy latitude. In practice, what this means is that the PRC's weakness will manifest itself in more things, like direct phone calls. For example, here between Taiwan's president and the US president, or more precisely in this case, the president-elect, more visits by major US policymakers, like this one from 2022, and more high-level meetings whenever Taiwan's president travels across the Pacific. The United States is not the only one involved in this, of course, but it is the big player. These things will all upset Beijing, but the idea is that the extra anger will be exactly proportional to the loss in PRC military power. And note that if you think that the corruption scandal is a drop in the bucket in terms of the military balance, then the observable implication of all of this is irrelevant. The line barely moves. In contrast, if you think it is major, then your default expectation should be a whole lot more fiery words, but not a whole lot more actual fire. This time because the line is moving by a lot, but again Taiwan's actions are just keeping pace with it. Now, you might think that it is strange that I have been using a bunch of qualifiers like default expectations. The reason is that changes to the distribution of power can affect the likelihood of war, but only through more layered mechanisms. As such, let's conclude this video by exploring a couple possibilities that marry corruption revelations and war, beginning with asymmetric information. The good news here, if you can call it that, is that we have a direct comparison to draw from. Heck, we have already done more than a half an hour on this very subject. One reason that wars occur is that when we are playing a game of guess where the red line is, it is not obvious where that red line actually should be. Remember that its location is tied to the distribution of power. So if Taiwan thinks that it should be here, but the PRC thinks that it should be here, and then perhaps Taiwan sets the policy to here, well, now Beijing is in a quandary. Is Beijing's intelligence assessment wrong? Or is Taiwan making a cunning bluff? Call the perceived bluff against a strong Taiwan, though, and you get a war. That is one perspective on what happened in February 2022. The Kremlin thought that the Russian military was strong. Ukraine had intelligence regarding significant structural problems within the Russian military, though, and instead held firm. Russia then invaded, only to discover the limits of its strength. The key problem, of course, was corruption, and the political problems of filtering that information to the top of the food chain. Fortunately, the revelations in China reduce the chances that something analogous might happen on the island. In this regard, the scandal could perversely be a win-win. Suppose that Taiwan knew about the PRC's problems. With the information revealed, Taiwan can successfully benefit from the extra latitude, and the PRC, previously at risk of making a catastrophic error, avoids the worst-case scenario. But note that it is not the corruption scandal itself that is changing the probability of war here. It is the PRC's new information that helps out. On the flip side, we have preventive war incentives. Now that Beijing knows that there is a problem, you can bet there is going to be a plan to fix it. This gives rise to the classic shifting lines problem, where the distribution of power may be here today, but will eventually move to here once things get sorted out. Even after accounting for the cost of war today, what you obtain by fighting now may be better than the best possible peace you could hope for later. It is called a preventive war because the actor losing power over time tries to prevent that from happening. However, the condition for war to occur here is that the magnitude of the power shift be at least as large as the sum costs of war. For the sake of illustration, I made that the case here. That said, while I get that the corruption scandal is a big deal for the PRC, it is not that big of a deal. When the power shift is more moderate, you instead get the waning actor, in this case Taiwan, able to implement a very favorable policy in the short run, perhaps even past what the PRC might get from war right now. This seems strange the first time you see it. Nonetheless, the reason is that the waning actor can essentially leverage the waxing actor's desire to not want to fight at an unfavorable moment. But then Taiwan must return to normal once the PRC has fixed its position. The central point here is that conflict initiation is not just a function of abilities. It is also a function of the coercive bargaining environment, which takes into account those abilities to exert leverage at the negotiating table. Well, that was a lot of lines on Pacific maps. If you want to learn more about the theory of war, and this time with a more Atlantic flavor, check out my book on the causes of Russia's invasion. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.